When we talk about World War II, we really need to talk about propaganda. Now, when we think of propaganda and we think of World War II, we usually think of or hear from other people about the propaganda posters and literature that the Nazis supposedly put out during the war, such as these posters and flyers that seem to depict Nazis, the Übermensch or super soldiers of the Nazi SS, and these startling, striking images with a very active art style. Now, you do need to realize that the poster you're seeing in front of you is actually simply a recruitment poster for the elite special forces of the Nazi army, which was the SS. So there's nothing extraordinary about posters like this. In fact, the United States had posters of its own, just like this, that were essentially the exact same thing for Americans. So when we're thinking of World War II and we're talking about propaganda, there was propaganda on all sides of this war. If I had to actually guess as to who was responsible for most of it, most of the propaganda seemed to come from the communists and the United States. But we'll see that in just a minute as we look through these different things that occurred and that were shown to the citizens all over the world. Planning Pearl Harbor. You know, one of the first pieces of propaganda used against the American people during the war was the encouragement for them to go to war at all. At first, the Americans did not want to enter World War II. The citizens had no desire to be a part of another, quote, world war like the one that had occurred in 1917. And so the public sentiment was heavily against World War II, against entering it at any cost. But what drove us into the war? Well, it was the attack on Pearl Harbor. On December 7th, 1941. Now, actually, what we find out if we do some study on this, and there's an incredible book about this called The Final Secret, and it was written actually just a few years after the war in 1954 by Robert A. Theobald. But in this book, he details the communications that came through the War Department about Pearl Harbor before the attack in December. In fact, the War Department had intercepted multiple communications by the Japanese about Pearl Harbor and knew that the attack was imminent. And in fact, if you look at your history, you'll realize that President Roosevelt actually forced the Japanese into the war by putting an embargo on the country. So they were under such duress as a country economically that they had to go to war to save their country. So number one, they were pushed into the attack on Pearl Harbor. Number two, Roosevelt and the War Department knew about the attack on Pearl Harbor. And thirdly, we see actually that on Sunday, November 30th of 1941, this is the Sunday a week before the Pearl Harbor attack, that the Hilo Hawaii Tribune newspaper reported with the headline, "Japan may strike over the weekend." And 1 week later, they of course did. So how did this newspaper know that Japan was going to strike? Well, the War Department certainly knew, and Roosevelt certainly knew. So in terms of propaganda, the turn of events that Roosevelt fostered and the War Department knew about gave the news media in America the ability to push entry into the war upon the American people with newspaper articles and media all over the country calling for vengeance against the Japanese. Brainwashing the American soldier. Now, of course, that's not the only propaganda that we saw. The next thing I want to bring your attention to is the movie director Frank Capra. Now, Frank Capra actually is responsible for some of the most patriotic films ever produced in Hollywood. From Mr. Deeds Goes to Town to State of the Union and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and even It's a Wonderful Life, which we all know as one of the most influential Christmas movies of all time. But what you may not know is that Frank Capra was hired by the War Department to produce propaganda films to be shown to the troops, the American troops in all of our military branches, to convince them to fight for the American people, specifically against the Germans. Capra directed a film series for the War Department called Why We Fight. The series included 12 parts. The 12th part was called Here is Germany. Watch a little bit of this video that was shown to our troops, people like my grandfather, people like your relative that was in the war. This video was shown to them to convince them of the atrocities of the German people.
An industrious people. These people look all right. The mailman, the farmer, the cop. They all look pretty much like the folks back home. Holding down jobs, raising families, enjoying life. They certainly look like the kind of people we can understand.
Or can we? A quiet, decent people who prepared 20 years to bring war into the world? A religious people who burn churches, imprison ministers, persecute the faithful? A kindly people who accept blood purges, pogroms, concentration camps? A gentle people who torture, starve, exterminate? These were men. They died in German concentration camps.
So you can see how the German people in that video are portrayed as normal everyday people. But then the propaganda begins when it starts to portray them as bloodthirsty, maniacal killers who wanted to bring war to the world, which is simply not true. The people of Germany did not believe that, and they intended simply to protect their own country from the invading forces of communism. And of course, the Jews and the Bolsheviks were at the heart of communism's invasion of their land. But you can see how this video would propagandize our troops to literally hate the Germans, even though they looked like normal everyday citizens. According to the video, they had a dark side. And this was part of the propaganda, that there was a dark side to the German people that wanted to slaughter everyone else in the world. And so our troops, under this brainwashing that they received, went overseas and did horrible, horrible things to the German people. Not to mention that our War Department sanctioned the bombing of civilians inside Germany. Instead of going after military targets, our government, along with the government of Britain and the other allies, went into Germany and literally bombed citizens intentionally to punish them for trying to defend their land. The Buchenwald Tour. Now, another piece of propaganda that came out of World War II was that in 1945, the Allies, quote, liberated the concentration camp of Buchenwald. And it's part of that liberation. Just days after the camp was liberated in April of 1945, the American and British troops, along with the Russian soldiers, brought in the German citizens of the Weimar Republic into that camp to give them a tour of the camp, a forced tour. I know that sounds strange. Why would our military and the military of our allies bring the German citizens into a concentration camp and force them to see the, quote, atrocities of that camp? So watch these clips of this video from just a few days after the liberation of Buchenwald camp.
1,200 civilians walked from the neighboring city of Weimar to begin a forced tour of the camp. There are many smiling faces, and according to observers, at first the Germans act as though this were something being staged for their benefit.
Note that it does say that this was a forced tour. These people were forced to go into this concentration camp. This would have been unheard of in history. Again, it smells and sounds and looks like propaganda because it is propaganda. This was to make the German people feel sorry for waging war to protect their homeland, to make them feel that they were in the wrong, that they were evil and didn't know it, that they were duped by the Nazi party, which was simply not the case. And note that the video said that the people, as they came into the camp, felt that it was staged for their benefit, which of course propaganda is staged.
One of the first things that the German civilians see as they reach the interior of the camp is the parchment display. On a table for all to gaze upon is a lampshade made of human skin, made at the request of an SS officer's wife. Large pieces of skin have been used for painting pictures, many of an obscene nature. There are 2 heads which have been shrunk to 1/5 their normal size. These and other exhibits of Nazi origin are shown to the townspeople.
The German citizens were forced to see these, quote, artifacts from the camp, pictures that were supposedly drawn on skin parchment of human beings, presumably Jews, and shrunken heads that were also presented to them as presumably Jewish shrunken heads, and also lampshades that were made out of human skin, allegedly. Now, it was said that these items that were shown on this table were owned by Ilse Koch, who was the wife of the commandant of the Buchenwald camp. However, there were some problems with that story. Number one, she had not lived at that camp for over 2 years prior to that time. So it seems strange that she would have all of these belongings there at the camp if she didn't live there. And furthermore, later on, after the Nuremberg trials, there was a U.S. general that did further research on some of these cases and felt that she was prosecuted for having these artifacts and for some of the atrocities of the camp without any evidence. So he actually commuted her sentence after the fact, after the Nuremberg trials. So it seems that most of what we see here in this camp forced tour that these Germans were forced to go through was propaganda and lies. And later on, lampshades like these were tested and examined by medical doctors and researchers. And through the years, different analyses have been done of these, quote, skins. And every time we seem to get a different result. Shortly after the war, some tests were done that claimed that these were actually cow skins. At another time, they were tested and found to be goat skins. And then a further test more recently was done by another group that said, yes, they were human skins. It seems to be that whoever tests these skins gets to decide what kind of skins they are. There doesn't seem to be any conclusive proof as to what they actually were, if they were human skins at all, which seems highly unlikely, given all these discrepancies. And just so you're aware, even though there were all these discrepancies with these items, and it seems highly unlikely that they actually had anything to do with either the leaders of this camp or with the people that were incarcerated there, these items were used to convict the German leaders of the camp during the Nuremberg trials. And by the way, just as a side note, I have watched some of the video from the Nuremberg trials, and in the amount of analysis that I have done, it seems that the accused Nazi leaders in the Nuremberg trials were really not allowed to defend themselves at all. For the most part, these were not trials, as far as I can tell. They were verbal beatings given to these Nazis. It was grandstanding, and it was done again for the propaganda of the public at large. These Nazi leaders were not given an actual chance to defend themselves, and no evidence was really presented. Things were simply read in front of them, and they were given little, if any, chance to respond to anything in the trials. It was a show, and it was propaganda done for the masses to think that these leaders had definitely been prosecuted for what they did, even though no evidence was actually presented, and the trials were not publicized to the general public. So nobody actually knew what happened in these trials.
The camera records the changes in facial expressions as the Weimar citizens leave the parchment display.
You'll notice in this video that it seems the propaganda was effective. As these German women came into this camp and saw these atrocities, many were very emotionally moved by it. Some fainted. And we do know that since this time, the German people in general have felt a strong sense of sorrow and regret over what happened in World War II. And it is likely because most of them were propagandized and re-educated after the war to believe just that they had been in the wrong the entire war, and that they had been duped by the Nazi party, the political party at the time, into going to war unjustifiably, which was absolutely not true.
The tour continues with a forced inspection of the camp's living quarters, where the stench, filth, and misery defied description. They see the result of lack of care in the bad case of trench foot.
And again, you'll notice in this video that they were forced to even tour the living quarters at the Buchenwald concentration camp, and that the smells were horrific. People were, of course, languishing. But of course, this was the end of the war, and the Nazis were losing because the Allies were bombing both civilian targets and military targets, and all of the supply lines to these camps were cut off. So yes, of course, people in the camps were starving. Typhus was running rampant because there was no ability for them to keep people fed and clothed and taken care of because the supply lines were all cut. And there was no way simply to care for the thousands of prisoners that they had in the camp appropriately. And there was nothing that the Nazis could do about this either. And this is not to say that no atrocities or bad things were ever done by any Nazis. Not at all. However, the evidence simply points to the fact that as the Allies were winning the war against Germany, that German supply lines were cut and that they had no way to care for the prisoners of war that they had taken into these camps. Post-war Hollywood propaganda. Now, it's interesting because as I've researched the time just after the war, it seems that the American citizens had some regret and some doubts about what actually happened in the war, and there was growing sentiment that perhaps it was not all that they were told it was. And so, of course, the American media and Hollywood had to do something about this. And it's very interesting because in the year 1946, the movie, again by Frank Capra, named It's a Wonderful Life, came out. And it was attacked when it came out. And of course, the reason it was attacked, and even though Frank Capra had done that kind of propaganda style video for the War Department during the war, he came out right after the war and he did this movie, It's a Wonderful Life, which depicted the greedy banker, Mr. Potter, as the villain in the movie. A banker who was trying to take over an entire town in small town America. And that James Stewart's character, George Bailey, was trying to stand against these bankers. So there was a lot of sentiment from generally the government against this movie. In fact, the FBI actually sent out a memo internally that talked about this movie and labeled it as communist propaganda because, of course, it was against the bankers. So it's interesting how the Hollywood media decided to try to combat things like this movie, It's a Wonderful Life. So the next awards ceremony, the Golden Globe Awards of 1947, came around. And It's a Wonderful Life was in the running for a few different Golden Globe Awards. But what happened is that later that same year in 1946, another movie had come out by the name of The Best Years of Our Lives. And this was directed by William Wyler. And this movie portrayed a specific sentiment over the war. One that kind of combated the American anti-war sentiment. And this movie, The Best Years of Our Lives, actually ended up winning the Golden Globe Best Picture Award the following year instead of It's a Wonderful Life. So watch this clip from The Best Years of Our Lives and see if you can spot the propaganda that's being shown to the American people.
What about a ham and cheese on whole wheat? Without any mustard?
Ham and cheese, Doc. Save the mustard. Coming up. Here you are. Hello, Homer.
Hi, Fred.
How have you been? Glad to see you.
Say, Fred.
Yeah?
What happened at Butcher's?
What do you mean?
I mean, you and Al. Was there any trouble?
Oh, no. We were just having a little friendly chat. There you are, sir. Thanks. What'll yours be, Homer?
Oh, I don't care. Give me a chocolate sundae.
Okay.
Hi,
How are you, soldier?
sailor.
Excuse me. Say, you mind if I ask you a personal question?
I know what it is. How did I get these hooks and how do they work? That's what everybody says when they start off. Do you mind if I ask you a personal question? Well, I'll tell you. I got sick and tired of that old pair of hands I had. You know, an awful lot of trouble washing them and manicuring my nails. So I trade them in for a pair of these latest models. They work by radar. Look. Pretty cute, eh?
You got plenty of guts. It's terrible when you see a guy like you that had to sacrifice himself. And for what?
And for what? I don't get you, mister.
Anything else for you?
Check. We let ourselves get sold down the river. We were pushed into war.
Sure, by the Japs and the Nazis, so we had...
Oh, the Germans and the Japs had nothing against us. They just wanted to fight the Limeys and the Reds. And they would have whipped them, too. We didn't get deceived into it by a bunch of radicals in Washington.
What are you talking about?
We fought the wrong people, that's all. Just read the facts, my friend. Find out for yourself why you had to lose your hands. And then go out and do something about it.
You better pay your check, brother, and go home.
Well, who do you think you are?
Be the cashier right over there.
Coffee, please.
Yes.
And there's another thing. Every soda jerk in this country's got an idea he's somebody.
Look here, mister. What are you selling anyway?
I'm not selling anything but plain old-fashioned Americanism.
Some Americanism. So we're all a bunch of suckers, eh? So we should have been on the side of the Japs and the Nazis, eh?
Again, I say, just look at the facts.
I've seen a couple of facts. I've seen a ship go down and over 400 of my shipmates went with it. Were those guys suckers?
That's the unpleasant truth. And the sooner we get wise to it, the better off we're going to...
Ooh, if I only had my hands.
You put those down!
Take your hands over there.
May I get through, please? Go get the druggist. Yes, sir.
Make way, please.
What happened? It was Fred Derry. He hit him. Bring some aromatic spirits of ammonia, iodine, and bandages. Yes, sir.
Don't say it, chum. The customer's always right, so I'm fired. But this customer wasn't right. I'll meet you outside in a minute, kid.
And so, as you saw in that clip, there's a man sitting in the cafe and he's reading the newspaper. And a war veteran comes in and sits down next to him. The war veteran is disabled. And this is, of course, to drum up sentiment in the audience so that they feel something for this character. Now, the other guy at the bar starts talking with this veteran and starts telling him he's not sure that the war was everything that it was cracked up to be, and that maybe we shouldn't have been over there in the first place. And of course, the veteran with the artificial arm hauls off and slugs the guy. And so this movie put out as propaganda to the American people the sentiment that if you questioned the war and you questioned our efforts in the war, then you deserve to be knocked out cold. So this was the War Department and Hollywood working together to drive American sentiment after World War II. Summary. I hope that this helps you see the propaganda that went on during World War II. And the more you study it, I'm sure you'll find out, as I have, that it doesn't seem like the Nazis actually were the ones putting out propaganda. It seems like the communists and the American War Department were the ones putting out all the propaganda, because they had to convince Americans to go to war. They had to convince Americans that the Germans were evil and needed to be destroyed. And of course, that's exactly what our American soldiers did, committing war crimes beyond imagination if you take the time to study. And then even after the war, we see that our American government propagandized us, our fathers and grandfathers who fought in the war, to believe that it was a noble cause, to believe that we had done something good by stamping out the German people for the most part. When you put all these puzzle pieces together, it's very sad. It saddens me, and it should sadden you. And we need to wake up to what happened in the world wars, because we were propagandized, as the whole world was. We were brainwashed. And I just hope that I can help some people understand the truth of what happened so that we never let it happen again.